All right, everybody, thank you for joining us. We are admitting the last people in the waiting room, so if you bear with us for just another minute. All right. Okay, so let's get started. Good morning and good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us for this second training session on climate risks and opportunities, and thank you for CDC for organizing this webinar. We will make a start now, and I will immediately hand over now to Maya, who will jump right into our housekeeping.
Thank you, Robin. Welcome everyone to today's training. It is scheduled to last 1.5 hours, including the Q&A portion. Please take your screen off of full screen mode to ensure that you can see both the camera and the slides. There will be a group exercise where you will be provided with 3 links via the chat box to answer a set of questions, so your active participation is requested. Please remain on mute until that group exercise portion of the training, and the recording and the slides will be available to download after this meeting. Regarding the Q&A, please submit in the Zoom chat box below at any time, and the Q&A will take place at the end of the webinar. Thank you.
All right, Maya, next slide, please. So thank you, Maya. So my name's Robin Hammerger Taylor. I'm a climate risk consultant here at Acclimatise. I was with you on webinar 1. And as with the first training, I am joined with my colleagues, John Firth, who's the co-founder and CEO of Acclimatise and a climate risk expert with extensive experience. And I'm also joined by my colleague, Anu Jogesh of Acclimatise, who's a policy and governance lead here. Next slide, please. So a quick overview of how this webinar training fits in with others. This webinar is the second of 3 training webinars that CDC is organizing. And many thanks to those of you who joined us a couple weeks back. That webinar provided a general overview of climate risks and opportunities and the TCFD framework and how financial institutions can get started. And today we turn our focus to the South Asia region in particular. And tomorrow we'll wrap up this series of webinar trainings by looking at climate risks and TCFD in Africa. Next slide, please. So turning to the learning objectives before we get started. We want to share these objectives for you today and really reiterate what we want you to come away with from this training session. So first, we want you to come away with an increased awareness and understanding of what key climate risks and opportunities are for your region. We also want you to come away with an improved understanding of how climate risk governance is taking shape in the region, and this is the piece on why you should get started acting on them, on climate risk management. We also want you to come away with an improved understanding of how your peers are getting started on climate risks and important networks emerging around the TCFD for financial institutions like you. And finally, we want you to leave this training with some early steps that you can take on your TCFD journey, which is really the how you can get started. So next slide. So the sessions we've planned for you today have a similar structure as webinar 1, which is to say they follow the what, the why, and the how elements of climate risks and how to get started. My colleague Anu Jogesh will lead the climate risks session and John will lead the governance session. And as Maya mentioned, there'll be a group exercise that we're going to run for you toward the end of the webinar, which will give you a chance to think through some of the actions and early decisions you need to take and to start taking action on TCFD. So I will lead that session and that exercise. And as Maya said, we really do encourage your active participation and engagement. A final word before we get started is that as with webinar 1, apart from the content covered in this agenda, the slide deck does include recommended readings for the South Asia region, and it also includes a table summarizing relevant networks for financial institutions like you who are getting started. So please do make use of those. And without further ado, I'll now hand over to Anu Jogesh to get started on session 1.
Thanks, Robin. Hi, everyone. I'm Anu Jogesh. And essentially, what I'm going to do is, in this section, we're going to talk about what the climate-related risks are to some specific countries in South Asia, but also dive a little bit further than we did in the previous webinar in terms of what they mean in terms of the risks the financial sector will be facing in the region and in some of these countries. All right, next slide, please. Let's take a minute to quickly recap the definitions that we went through the last time, which is physical and transition climate risks, before we proceed. Now, physical risks are those arising from long-term incremental shifts in climate patterns or extreme weather events. Now, extreme weather events can include rainfall, floods, storm surges, glacial lake outbursts, and clearly South Asian countries are more than familiar with these. But physical risks also include slow onset changes, that are incremental, not easy to spot immediately, temperature rise, average temperature rise, sea level rise, glacial melt, and so on. Now, when we talk about transition risks, these are risks arriving from the processes of adjusting to a low carbon economy. Now, many countries in South Asia have committed to voluntary climate targets as part of the NDC that have some mitigation targets. We also have national climate plans that include mitigation components. We're seeing, market shifts towards building a low carbon economy. We're certainly seeing shifts in the renewable energy consumption and supply patterns. So transition risks can be triggered by changes in policy, the regulatory and legal landscape, market preferences, but even technological shifts. Now, in this webinar, what we're going to do over the next few slides is pick on a few countries when we focus on physical risks in particular. So we're going to look at India, Bangladesh, and Nepal. But I do have information for some of the other countries if you are interested later in the webinar. Next slide, please. Thank you. So let's start with India. We already know, and I don't know if anybody's sort of based in Delhi from the webinar right now, it's been raining elephants at the moment. So we've known that for the last few months, the monsoon rains and the torrential monsoon rains rather have resulted in, or rather inundated large parts of the country, both in the north and the northeast. We've seen almost 3 million people displaced and impacted. We've also, during this pandemic period, had 2 cyclones. The one of them, was on the Arabian Sea, was actually considerably unprecedented. And this has impacted populations across the region as well. Going forward, what we're likely to see is an increase in the magnitude and frequency of a number of impacts. Greater intensity of rainfall and flooding, more infrequent and more intense heat waves, and the coastal areas, greater storm surges and cyclones. Now, with rising temperatures, heat waves are expected to and already do impact worker productivity, especially in sectors like agriculture, construction, largely the informal sector. But in terms of scale, floods are expected to have a larger socioeconomic and monetary impact and result in losses to both businesses and communities. We've already started aggregating what this means macroeconomically. Losses from disasters have doubled this decade in India over the last decade, largely led by floods and cyclones. In many ways, in the last 2 sort of decades at least, we've seen a shift in monetary losses sort of being superseded for floods rather than for droughts. Now, sectoral impacts are broad. This is a big country. But if we were to focus on some sectors, certainly agriculture, some parts of infrastructure, public utilities, and this will put fiscal pressure on the government. Now, according to a recent World Bank report, in the future, climate change can result in present value loss in GDP of over 800 billion by 2050. Now, there is a consideration of why we're looking at 2050 values and what they mean for businesses and institutions that typically have shorter planning and lending cycles. I think at this stage, and before we move to talking about Bangladesh and Nepal, it's worth noting that much of the climate change is already locked in, at least until the 2050s and likely after that, depending on the kinds of growth trajectories we follow. And model-based projections for the future are sort of indicative of that trend. There are limited differences in what models indicate and the variations between them, because they do vary between what we'll see, say, in the 2030s, between what we'd see in the 2050s. And a lot of risk assessment and vulnerability frameworks, whether it's the private or the public sector, encourages that sort of a time scale in planning. Next slide, please. Now for Nepal, Nepal is deeply vulnerable. Over 80% of the population is currently exposed in some regions to drought, some regions floods, landslides, extreme temperature, and glacial lake outburst floods. Now, in the future, what you're expecting or what's projected is greater warm days, increased precipitation, increased glacial melt in some areas, which is sketchy because this is where the information from the Himalayas is sketchy, but we certainly know higher frequency floods and landslides. Now, impacts are expected most acutely in agriculture, water, energy, road infrastructure. Let's take a sectoral example. Now, hydropower drives the Nepali economy. Nepal is a big consumer and exporter of hydropower. And we've seen two big projects already being sanctioned last year from the funding from the IFC, this year jointly with India. And essentially, what we do know and what the studies do show is that erratic precipitation, increased sedimentation, but also flash floods and landslides can significantly impact hydropower productivity in the long run. Knock-on effects and on energy supply, on communities, assets, suppliers, and also lenders. So macroeconomically, what this means is climate change costs are projected to shave off anywhere between 2 to 3% of the current GDP annually by mid-century for Nepal. Next slide, please. Bangladesh is likely the most vulnerable of the three countries we are talking about, and not just because of the hazards, but the socioeconomic conditions as well. And Bangladesh is already familiar with some of the most devastating impacts of floods and storm surges. A quarter of the country is currently inundated because of the monsoon rains I just spoke about over the last 2 months. Now, Cyclone Amphan, which came through the Bay of Bengal and also hit Bangladesh, has resulted in estimated losses of anywhere, or rather between 100 and 130 USD million for the country. And in the future, Bangladesh is expected to be considerably hotter but wetter. So increased frequency and magnitude of cyclones, floods, and storm surges. But critically, sea levels are expected to rise by over 17% by 2050 and likely inundating large parts of the country. Now, sectorally, we already know that Bangladesh sees losses in output and employment in the agriculture sector, and this is expected to exacerbate. Now, impacts also in industry and construction sector and utility services. Now, the same World Bank study notes that climate change could result in a present value loss in GDP of over $120 billion for Bangladesh by 2050. Now, before we segue into what this means for the financial sector, South Asia is vulnerable not just because of the hazards we just spoke about, but other socioeconomic and topographical considerations. We have high population densities across. Communities are already economically vulnerable. Many who lack access to basic services are in more exposed locations. So essentially, climate change is very much a risk multiplier for South Asia, both communities, businesses, and in turn, the economy and the financial sector. So next slide, please. Let's look a little bit into what this means for the financial sector. The previous slide. Thanks. So for India, for the very first time, we actually have banks and financial institutions that have articulated their views on what physical risks mean as part of their CDP responses, because CDP over the last 2 years has finally aligned some of its questions to the TCFD framework. Now, to be fair, a number of these banks and FIs have been quite circumspect about their current risks. But in terms of what this means for the future, there hasn't been any ambiguity. Now, let's look at State Bank of India. It is the largest public sector bank in India. And State Bank has actually said that extreme weather events will impact loan payments, and SBI will be susceptible to credit risks in the future. Axis Bank has talked about reduced revenue from decreased production capacity and operating costs for its counterparties, also loss in agricultural production, and the bank is a significant lender in these sectors. Now, Kotak Mahindra Bank has also talked about an increased delinquency ratio for the bank's agriculture and allied sectors and loss of business opportunities in these sectors. In bank, like others, has also talked about business continuity risks for its own operations, so physical damage to its assets and infrastructure, employee health and welfare. Mahindra and Mahindra Financial Services, which essentially lends to the peri-urban and rural customers and actually incorporates some monsoon-based data in its risk models, has also said that there will be an increasing risk of non-performing assets as customers are not able to repay loans. And there will be reduced revenues from climate impacts, which would also lead to lower sales and outputs. Now, again, there is a component here that is not just tied to the hazards, but how vulnerable the sector itself is. We do know, for instance, in terms of priority sector lending, that 50% of aggregate bank credit is sort of tied to sectors like agriculture, energy, micro, small, and medium enterprises, which are all highly vulnerable sectors. So clearly, the financial sector has much to think about in India. Next slide, please. Now, there's relatively far less data emerging from banks and FIs in Bangladesh and Nepal. But there are some reports, and one report actually noted that Nepal's bank assets are essentially in agriculture, forestry, construction, and real estate, which are vulnerable. Nepal also has priority sector lending. So for instance, some institutions are mandated to lend to the agriculture sector, about 10% and about 15% combined to tourism and hydropower and energy. And we spoke about the vulnerability of energy and hydropower sectors for the country. Now, Nepal's economy is also heavily reliant, in fact, for Bangladesh as well, on international finance, whether it's lending from development finance institutions, whether it's foreign direct investments or long-term commercial debt. So the continuity of such external financing will likely be shaped by how sort of policies and regulations evolve in the creditor countries. And that's something for Nepal and Bangladesh, and actually Pakistan also to think about. In Bangladesh, it's interesting to note that there are reports that say that despite being so disaster prone, the country does not collect data on disaster incidents and losses for the financial sector. And this is clearly a gap. There was one study that noted that disasters routinely result in credit defaults, lower saving attitudes, withdrawal of existing sort of savings by clients. And much of this, like I mentioned earlier, is already tied to how vulnerable some of the borrowers are, retail investors, small business owners. And over time, these trends are projected to impact Bangladeshi banks' long-term profitability, lending, and deposit services, but also the quality of their collateral. Now, this is really a sense of where physical risks are and how some of the FIs are very much vulnerable. But we have transition risks to also consider. So I'm going to hand this over to Robin to talk about some of the transition risks.
All right, thanks, Anu. So now turning to transition risks and first looking at India. We see that India has evidence of all three transition risk drivers, so changes in policy and regulation, technological advances, and changes which are offering good alternatives to fossil fuels, and changes in market demand. We see that in India's published NDC, the government has made commitments to reduce its emissions, reduce fossil fuel electricity generation, and increase carbon sinks, importantly. So NDCs are a country's nationally determined contribution, and it's part of the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement Article 4 requires each party to prepare, communicate, and maintain NDCs. It's important to note that NDCs will be ratcheted up over time as there's a requirement to essentially publish successive NDCs. So while there are current targets as part of a country's NDC, there will certainly be stricter targets in the future. So keep that in mind when you see these targets on this slide and the next few slides. And that essentially means that the time is now to get started in managing the transition risk that we all know is coming and will be there in the future. So I want to turn briefly now to the graph on the slide, which shows India's Energy Transition Index score. The ETI was developed by the World Economic Forum, and it helps indicate how ready a country is essentially for the energy transition. It's a quick way to gauge transition risk, but I do want to be clear, there are other drivers of transition risk that the ETI may not fully capture, and that includes instances where policy changes elsewhere can have an impact on a country, or when technology or market demand and patterns shift elsewhere and then that impacts a country. So sort of in addition to the ETI scores, I will flag that where I can, where other transition risks are emerging due to patterns that are not picked up by the ETI. So with India, we can see that it's technically still within the emerging group, which is the bottom left quadrant of the graph, but it is quite close to the leapfrogging group on the right. And this shows perhaps more transition risk than others in the emerging group. A key part of India's overall ETI score was the regulation and political commitment seen in the country, and the ETI flags that there's a particularly strong commitment to energy efficiency and renewable energy regulation in India, and which is essentially making it ready for the transition. Next slide, please. So this strong commitment to renewable energy by the government, and you can see the extensive renewable energy targets listed there, coupled with improved solar technology in the country, has really helped drive down prices for photovoltaic panels. I touched on this in webinar 1, but I'll sort of touch on it again here. PV module prices across a range of technologies has decreased by around 60% between 2013 and 2018. And that means that essentially solar power now is quite cheap to install and operate. Power supply auctions from 2019 have shown that renewables can be offered at around less than actually 3 rupees per kilowatt hour. And it's essentially a tariff that coal-fired generators are having quite a bit of difficulty matching as they have higher capital and operating costs. So this shift in solar and renewable energy in India is sort of illustrating there that it's touching on all 3 drivers of transition risk. Okay, next slide, please. Turning to Bangladesh, the country's also made commitments in its NDC around reducing greenhouse gas emissions in certain sectors, and we understand that this is now being revised with new targets as of 2020. Bangladesh also has targets on energy efficiency. It does have a relatively low score on the 2019 ETI, which is it ranks 90th in terms of transition readiness. And you can see that Bangladesh is still within the emerging group, the bottom left quadrant. It is closer than many other countries in this group to the leapfrogging group, which shows, again, perhaps more transition risk in this country than others in the emerging group, which is somewhat similar to India. Market drivers of transition risk seem to give way to the policy drivers here, though changes we see in the Indian renewable energy markets could in fact spill over here in future. So that means, you know, cheaper solar panels there could increase the solar industry here in Bangladesh. There's also indication that the country's new energy plan, which is due to be released this year, will be revising down the number of coal power plants that will be built. So the energy transition is underway there as well. Next slide, please. Turning to 2 other countries in the region, both Nepal and Pakistan also have climate targets set out in their NDCs as shown here. And remember, these targets will only get more stringent in the future as NDCs are ratcheted up. Both countries do score low on the ETI, and you can see Nepal's at 93 and Pakistan's at 97. So the transition is maybe a little bit less ready here. That said, a couple weeks ago, Pakistan began to develop a plan to boost its share of electric power that comes from renewables up to 30% by 2030, which would be up from current levels, which are at 4% right now. So they do have plans to increase this over the next decade. And Nepal is now focusing heavily on renewable energy, which we see in its increasing investment, which Anu touched on briefly, and requirements for investment in hydropower. And as with Bangladesh, there may be spillover of low PV panel costs to Pakistan and Nepal in future as well, with the large scale market there in India, just nearby. Okay, next slide, please. Looking now at the evidence we can see around transition risks as financial risks, a recent study published by the Institute for Energy Economics and Financial Analysis found that the thermal power generation sector is posing actually a quite serious threat to banks in the country. The sector has potentially 40 to 60 billion dollars US dollars in non-performing or stranded assets. And this study found that India's parliamentary standing committee that looked at a list of stranded assets in 2018 could have grossly underestimated the true extent of the problem or the true amount of financial risk present in the sector due to these stranded assets. Now, to be clear, there are multiple reasons why these facilities are becoming non-performing or stranded assets, and there's a list shown here on the slide. But the study did find that one of the contributing factors behind the stranded assets is increasingly cheaper renewable energy that we talked about. So we're seeing electricity power distribution companies called discoms. They're already renegotiating their purchasing power agreements, their PPAs, with coal plants in favor of renewable supply. And renewable energy PPAs are now consistently being signed at rates around 20 to 30% cheaper than coal. Both new and built power plants are being stranded. Built plants are found in this study to be unable to operate at a competitive price sufficient to deliver a viable return to investors, and new plants are sometimes not even being able to be finished. So as you know, the government, the Indian government does already provide some support to the thermal power generation sector. But the question is, what is the threshold for this really? And at which point will this no longer be a viable option for the government? And it's uncertain, but it could be with the financial burden that the government's taking on with COVID, that maybe less support will be available, and perhaps COVID could speed up the transition away from fossil fuels as the government withdraws support from this sector. So it's something to bear in mind. All right, thank you. So that was an overview of physical risks that Anu touched on and transition risks that I touched on that the region's facing. Now, the TCFD calls for climate analysis of climate-related opportunities alongside risks. And we touched on this in webinar 1. And you can begin to look for investing and lending needs among the various types of clients that you have as part of your TCFD response. It's also worth stressing here that financial institutions can be ahead of the curve of both physical and transition risks by already starting to allocate capital toward resilient and low carbon technologies, sectors, or infrastructure. This slide shows examples of opportunities stemming from physical risks as well as those stemming from transition risks in your region. It's not meant to be an exhaustive list, but it can kind of give you an idea of the types of emerging opportunities, and you can use this framework to think about where and what climate-related opportunities might be for you. So you can look at opportunities across a wide range of clients who are at various stages, and that includes clients who are managing current risks, clients who are responding to new and emerging climate risks, or clients adapting to broader market shifts or transitions. For physical risk clients who are already experiencing physical hazards and managing them will need investment in things like climate smart agriculture technologies, including drip feed irrigation. Um, you can think about clients that are responding to emerging transition risks, such as emerging emissions targets, and they could need investment, for example, in energy efficiency technologies and solutions in their businesses. And finally, you could think about governments who also will need support in future to finance low carbon and resilient infrastructure as part of smart grid measures, for example, or nature-based solutions such as green roofs and natural flood defenses. Next slide, please. So this slide shows the results from a recent 2017 IFC study across the South Asia region, and it estimated climate investment potential by country and sector out to from 2018 to 2030. And this study is based on each country's NDC and the targets and objectives it listed in them. So we touched on those a little bit before. The IFC estimates across the region there's a need for 3.4 trillion in climate investment between 2018 and 2030. So some of the standout figures I've circled here are the green building sector, and that means energy efficient buildings and energy efficiency services for buildings, which could see investments over 1.5 trillion across the region by 2030. And in India and Bangladesh in particular lead the need for energy efficiency investments. Another sector to flag is a transport sector. Investment needs for electric vehicles and transport infrastructure combined rather is over 950 billion US by 2030. And importantly, the IFC flags in this study that the transition to low carbon and resilient growth can really only be achieved with the help of strong private sector engagement. So the business case for addressing climate change and pursuing sustainable growth continues to strengthen. And we're seeing positive returns on investment now and improved operational resilience. And so essentially it's saying that there's a real role for financial institutions to play in here, in the region in building climate resilience. So it's not going to be only up to governments to fund these NDC commitments. So that's a call to you and when you're thinking about opportunities. Next slide, please. And here we wanted to just pull a couple examples of climate-related opportunities by country, and this pulls from the IFC on the IFC study on the last slide, as well as other sources. For Nepal, we see opportunities in renewable energy, green buildings, electric vehicles, solid waste management, and climate-smart agriculture. And to the right, you'll see examples of climate-smart agriculture related investments. In Bangladesh, we see climate-smart agriculture as well as green buildings as key areas. And in India, for the adaptation measures alone, measures to adapt, help India adapt to physical climate hazards, this could total around US 2 trillion, and that could be across agriculture, fisheries, infrastructure, water resources, and ecosystem management. So there are a lot of emerging opportunities and areas that you can look for this when you get started with TCFD. Right, last slide. We just want to do a quick wrap up of session 1. So it's a rapid fire session, but we saw we reviewed climate risks for South Asian markets for current day 2030s and 2050s. We heard that particularly relevant climate risk hazards for the region include flooding, cyclones, and heat waves, and that these are already impacting businesses and households, and that this will get worse in the future. I touched on transition risks, which are driven by policy and market changes in the region, and these are already impacting the energy sector, with the thermal power generation and coal sector in particular under fire right now. Other carbon intense sectors who can't easily switch energy supplies are also at risk from transition risks. There's growing evidence that we talked about of both physical and transition risks leading to credit risks and financial risks, as these climate risks are associated with increased defaults of your clients. In the future, we're expecting value corrections in the region, in particular in the energy sector and other sectors that are carbon intense. And finally, we touched on opportunities briefly that are stemming from both transition and physical risks in the region. And these are estimated to, again, their top $3.4 trillion of investment need off the back of countries' commitments via NDCs. So we know that investment in opportunities is one way that financial institutions can get ahead of the physical and transition risks in the region. And key examples include climate smart agriculture solutions, energy efficiency measures, and electric transport and infrastructure, among the others I listed. So with that, I will end this session and I'll hand back over to Anu and John, who will, next slide, Maya, will take you through the climate risk governance landscape in South Asia. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Robin. Great. So in this section, let's talk about why South Asian financial institutions need to start analyzing, evaluating climate risks, and where there needs to be an increased awareness of the drivers for these. Let's start with a sort of slide we had shown in the previous webinar about key climate risk and governance drivers, but we've added one critical one here that is very much South Asia linked. So let's go through these. In terms of market-led initiatives, you do have the TCFD framework, and this is seen as market-led because it was developed by FIs and corporates, and for other FIs and corporates. There are also regulatory and oversight processes. There can be progress in terms of formal mandates from financial regulators and central banks on climate risk analysis. There could also be a spillover in terms of international regulation spilling over. Of course, stakeholder expectations, and this can include changing requirements and demands from clients, investors, but also other development banks that lend and invest to banks in the region. And this is especially true, and we've already seen this for banks and FIs that have credit lines from international funders. But critically, a driver for South Asia is very much its vulnerability to climate impacts. It is very much becoming a material risk. We're already a disaster-prone region, and it's expected to get much worse than what banks and financial institutions have been historically able to sort of predict and handle, or what government's current regulation and interventions can reliably cover, because there's always this conversation about the backstopping processes that the governments put in place in these countries, and will that be enough given what is projected to happen in the future. And I'd like to just stay with one last point here, because these are questions we often get asked when we meet South Asian banks and financial institutions. One is about, should South Asian banks and financial institutions be thinking about assessing, much less disclosing, climate risks when the financial market is very much at a different pace and level compared to more mature economies? Also, given the current economic slump post-COVID, is this something that they should be focusing on? The other, of course, is very much around the articulation in international negotiations, which is, we didn't create the problem. Should we be expected to focus on addressing it? And the third is, as I'd mentioned earlier, there's already some degree of weather-related risk built in to some models for financial institutions, especially in terms of where they lend. Given how disaster-prone the region is, isn't that sufficient? And I come back to this point again about what the models are showing us about how vulnerable South Asia is. And very much it is a material risk. It will likely impact current growth projections for the financial sector, even in the sort of economic slump that they're seeing, and it could sort of further exacerbate the slowdown. And the other point is that because it is a material risk, it can't be the proverbial region in a sinking boat waiting for, or rather regulation and changes from the global north, because this is very much something that is impacting us immediately. Next slide, please. I think because we are disaster prone, there is already a sort of a climate risk governance landscape. It doesn't cover climate very explicitly. It does in some respects, but not entirely. Let's get into one example, the example of in Bangladesh. Bangladesh Bank has been active in terms of policy interventions that drive some risk analysis and investing in what is broadly green. So they have the environmental and social risk management guidelines, which were updated in 2017, which include mainstream environmental risk, but also covers possible sources of disaster and climate-related risks, such as like cyclones and droughts. Bangladesh also issued a taxonomy for products eligible for green financing. There's the Climate Risk Fund that mandates that 10% of bank CSR funding, which actually is minuscule, but still it's there to support disaster-affected communities during specific climate and disaster impacts. And there's also the Green Transformation Fund providing access to international funds that allows re-lending to Bangladeshi banks for green products and services. So there's clearly some mechanisms in place. There are equal examples, or rather similar examples in India and Nepal as well. So there is a sort of a framework that's already in place that is thinking about sustainability, thinking about green, and certainly thinking about investing in mitigating climate impacts. John, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Neil, and good morning, good afternoon, everybody. Can you just go to the next slide, please, Maya? Thank you. Just before I start into these slides, I just want to touch base again on why is TCFD important and why is it you should consider this. The interesting thing about TCFD, it actually places you in a competitive position and provide you with greater capacity and capability to respond to regulation, which is coming. It also helps you think about investor mandates and questions that they may ask you, and also puts you in a place where you're beginning to explore and understand changing market and customer demands and conditions. So TCFD is very much part and heart of the governance of the business going forward, whether it's a corporate, whether it's or it's in the financial services sector. Now, when we look at climate risk governance and start to understand the various actions that are taking place, we begin to see that TCFD, as a set of recommendations, sits at the heart of just about every single initiative that is currently underway in the financial sector. One of these, for example, is the Network for Green the Financial System, which is a coalition or an organisation of central banks and supervisors. There's currently just over 60 central banks from around the world, and we've listed out those particularly in Southeast Asia and East Asia here, and clearly we've identified some very big hitting banks in terms of China, Korea and Japan, for example. But what's important about these is this is the central banks sharing and learning from each other and beginning to explore what does regulation mean, what does governance mean, and how do we influence the governance of the financial sector companies which we are responsible for and which we regulate. So there is an awful lot of learning and sharing going on behind the scenes, and that inevitably means beginning to see a coalescing of ideas about regulation. And what we are seeing clearly is regulation is coming into place, particularly in Europe at the moment. Let's go to the next slide, please. Some examples of where these networks are beginning to develop and coalesce around the concept of TCFD, for example, can be seen with the development banks. We've listed out some of the banks and investors in this space, including CDC, but also the International Finance Corporation, SVED Fund from Sweden, the European Investment Bank, and KfW from Germany. And there are others. In fact, all the multilateral development banks are working very, very closely on the whole process of alignment with the Paris Agreement, on thinking about taxonomies, on thinking about how do they integrate climate change, both transition and resilience, physical risk, into their business practices, and therefore how it influences the operations of the businesses and organizations in which they invest. So we need to understand that sitting around you, and may not have touched upon you yet, but will, is this growing network and sharing of ideas and thoughts and movement. Asian Development Bank is not down on this list, but that's simply because it is actually not signed up to TCFD. But for anybody who's been working with ADB recently, you'll recognize that they are incredibly active on the whole climate change front. And for example, every one of their projects is screened at lending risk stage in terms of climate change impacts. Next slide, please. And just continue this theme of action and what's going on around you. When we look at the actual signed up supporters to TCFD, there's currently just over 1,000 supporters from a broad range of sectors with a current market capitalization of over $12 trillion. There are 595 banks, insurers, and investors included in that. And whilst there are only 2 banks in India, Pakistan, Nepal, Bangladesh, Myanmar, and Sri Lanka, what is important to recognize is that contained within that 595 bank figure are all the world's global commercial and investment banks. And they clearly are operating in the region. I know you'll be working with them on occasion. They are employing TCFD as a governance, strategic, and risk management metric and target practice. This is beginning to influence the way they run their businesses. So even though you may not be doing anything on TCFD at the moment, the people you work with are. And again, it's this creeping general move towards adoption of TCFD across the world. Can you move to the next one, please? And I think just bearing that theme in mind, that of this peer action, we just identify one. There are a whole host of initiatives that have developed. This is one, the Principles for Responsible Investment. There are 4 signatories within India. All these initiatives all have one common thread. They all align to the TCFD process. And what does that suggest to you? Well, it says don't jump into one of the initiatives first. Really, you need to think about TCFD, explore it for yourself, familiarize yourself with it and what your peers are doing and what your regulators and banking structure and systems are thinking, and then decide perhaps which initiative is right for you, because there's an awful lot of guidance and help and support that these initiatives can give. But TCFD is a starting point. I'm going to hand back now to Anu.
Next slide, please.
Oh, Robin, sorry.
That's okay. All right, everybody. So we wanted to share this example of how one bank got started on climate risk analysis for the purposes of their TCFD work. So it's not a South Asian bank, but it is a bank from an emerging economy. So we hope it's still relevant for you. And essentially, it's an example from Itaú Unibanco, which is a bank in Brazil. And this bank participated in the Unipify TCFD pilot, which Unipify is the United Nations Environment Program Finance Initiative. If you're not familiar, I'll come on to that in a minute. They had a TCFD pilot with 16 commercial banks, and Itaú was one of them. Acclimatise and other consultants helped support this group of banks to develop an early methodology for analyzing physical climate risks and transition risks. So this example I'll talk you through really briefly for the sake of time is Itaú's physical risk analysis that they did for the agriculture sector in Brazil. You can see there's steps listed out that they took, kind of simplified steps there. They first selected climate scenarios and time horizons, as well as a set of physical climate hazards that cover, importantly, incremental, and in TCFD language this means chronic hazards, and extreme events in TCFD language, that's acute hazards. The group in Acclimatise had conducted a full literature search of the existing climate impact studies in the agriculture sector. It's a very well-studied sector, so we were quite lucky there. Not all sectors are well studied, it's important to flag that, but we had located studies which really help show how these hazards affect agricultural indicators such as production levels, prices, and costs. Itaú then took the studies and evaluated how the credit quality of their clients would change, and they did this on a representative sample of their clients, and how those indicators would change under these scenarios and time periods shown here. I also want to flag really briefly the different groups that were involved. So in the pink box on the right, there were groups from across the entire organization involved in this exercise. Next slide, please. Okay, and so this slide shows a table with the results that they calculated. Looking at the second column from the left, this shows how the chronic hazards or extreme events changed revenues for this group of 14 clients. The two columns to the right of that show how the acute hazards changed revenues and costs for their clients in the agriculture sector. And these changes were calculated as change by 2040 from a current baseline. The final column shows Itaú's qualitative assessment of the climate impacts. So to reach this score, a climate adjusted balance sheet was projected for their clients. And this is by taking their actual current balance sheet and changing this by the impacts resulting from total physical risk. So those other three columns to the left. And this resulted in a climate adjusted balance sheet. And from that, Itaú calculated a projected credit rating and compared it with the current credit rating, producing a qualitative impact score. So it's a quick example of how you can get started and start to look at one sector and geography for physical risk. And you can find this and other examples of physical risk analysis and also transition risk analysis in these Unipify reports. The physical risk analysis report is called Navigating a New Climate, and it's linked on the bottom of this slide. And essentially with that, I think due to time, we are going to move on. Next slide. One quick example I wanted to touch on. So this slide is that list of resources and networks that you can tap into of financial institutions that are already getting started on TCFD. And one quick example I wanted to highlight is the Unipify. So I mentioned that in the last example. This is our top recommendation for you. They do have an Asia Pacific group, and essentially they come together and procure together in a club. They procure expertise to guide them and develop methodologies on TCFD, implementing the TCFD recommendations for physical and transition risk. So do look at these. There's also the Asian Investor Group on Climate Change, but Unipify is probably our top pick if you're thinking about joining a network to get started on TCFD. Okay, slide 33. Next slide. A final wrap up here, one point to just really reiterate is that by getting started with TCFD, we've made the case that you can get ahead of the curve in terms of potential regulations and mandates on climate risk management. There's other points here as well, but I will move on. We now need to move to our exercise. So in this in this exercise, in this final session, we want to offer a quick refresher on the TCFD framework and take you through an exercise. So next slide, please. The TCFD has recommendations across 4 pillars as shown here: governance, strategy, risk management, and metrics and targets. And in total, it has 11 detailed recommendations on disclosures that you should make. But the TCFD, as we talked about in webinar 1, is a lot more than just a set of recommended disclosures for financial institutions and corporates. And really, it should be seen as a sort of roadmap on how to take action on climate risk management. So it asks you to look across actions in these 4 pillars as shown here. But we think the best way to get started with TCFD, as we mentioned in webinar 1, is to look at the governance pillar and unpack that a bit. And we also think the risk management pillar is a good place to start, as there are things there that you can set in motion to really get going on your climate risk and opportunity analysis. So I'll talk you through briefly on those a little bit before we get into the actual exercise. Next slide, please. Under the governance pillar, TCFD suggests organizations disclose their governance structures around climate-related risks and opportunities. But what does that mean for you? How can this guide you? Your organization, when thinking about governance under TCFD, needs to think about setting up the roles and responsibilities for climate risk and opportunity management. You need to think about the resources that you need, including the skills and knowledge and time to manage climate risks. And you can ask yourselves questions like, has the board identified climate risks as a relevant issue? Is there appropriate oversight at board level of climate risks? Has the board assigned clear roles and responsibilities for the identification, assessment, and management of climate risks? Turning to next slide, TCFD pillar risk management. TCFD suggests you should disclose how the organization identifies, assesses, and manages climate-related risks. So what does this mean and how can this guide you? As part of your engagement with the risk management pillar of TCFD, you can begin to survey internal capacities that you need for external support and to do the climate risk analysis. You can consider scenario analysis. You should consider scenario analysis approaches as part of your assessment. And you also need to consider integration. So I will, next slide, please. I'll take you through really briefly here some of the approaches that you can take to risk management. And this is just a sketch so that you can start to get to familiar with what a risk management approach for climate risk may look like. For both physical and transition risks, you can start by screening for climate risks with analytical tools and services. And that's to see how exposed a sector, company, or project, or even portfolio is to a certain climate risk. And then you can take a tailored approach there as shown. Next slide, please. So the risk management pillar also suggests you need to look at scenario analysis in your risk assessments. Scenario analysis has become a buzzword, so we want to really quickly highlight a couple things to keep in mind when you're getting started with it. Selecting scenarios to use for physical risk analysis and assessments is different than selecting scenarios for transition risk. It's important to note that these scenarios are not forecasts. They're storylines of plausible futures. So when you're doing transition risk or physical risk assessments, you need to select plausible futures for those types of risks that you're assessing, and they're not the same. So transition risks will be interested in climate scenarios that have a lower temperature, as this assumption means more mitigation policies and technologies are rolled out, and therefore there's more transition risk. So that means for transition risk, you need to select 1.5 or 2 degrees scenarios. For physical risk, you need to select scenarios where there's likely to be more physical risk, and that means scenarios with a higher temperature increase. So that means 3 or 4 degrees. The next 2 slides talk through some other differences, and essentially I will skip over these, but when you're going through the slide deck, you can engage with them a bit more. The point is that if you go back 1 slide, sorry, Maya, transition risk scenarios are often available off the shelf. They're constructed narratives that you can use, and they're a lot more developed than physical risk scenarios. Physical risk scenarios are essentially what we have right now to work with are IPCC representative concentration pathways, which is the next slide. And so when you're selecting them, there will be less developed narratives around the physical risk, but you can still select these scenarios. And RCPs, you'll need to select ones that relate to the temperature increases I talked about. So RCP 2.6 and 8.5 are what we typically recommend as they relate to about 2 degrees and 4 degrees, which is a high and a low scenario. So with that, I will move on to sorry, there's one more slide before the exercise, and the last bit of that you need to consider under the risk management pillar is the integration of what you're doing into existing climate risk assessments into existing risk management framework. So bear that in mind as well. And you'll need to integrate these things shown here on the slide. All right, moving to the exercise. We will have probably about 20 minutes for this exercise. And if you just bear with us, we will switch screens in a minute and send you a link. Maya, are you going to be able to send the links in the chat box?
Yep, so I've just posted the first one.
Okay, so we are going to be asking you a set of 3 questions, and they mirror the 3 areas that we've included in this training in webinar 1. So part 1 is about what are the climate risks that are relevant to you and your loans and your holdings and investments. Part 2 is around why you should care about managing them, or what governance pressures are you facing. And part 3 is about how you can use the TCFD framework to get started in managing them, in particular looking at the governance and risk management pillars that I just talked about. So we will share the results from the exercise with the group and reflect on this together at the end of the exercise. So next slide, please. So as Maya has put in the chat box, there is the first link. So everyone, if you can please go click that link, and you will be asked to think about the focus of your potential analysis, physical risk or transition, and which key drivers or hazards you're facing. And so please let us know if you have any problems with accessing that link, but everyone should be using the link now.
And just to also say, it's a Google Forms link. So I see there's also 2 other links in the chat box, but if you could click the Google Forms one, that's where it'll take you to the exercise. Thank you.
All right, and we'll check back with you in a couple minutes to give you the next link. Okay, so we see some answers coming in, but now we're going to move to, so you can continue to answer that, but please only submit one response for part 1. But if you can, now Maya, if you can release the link for part 2 and change slides. So part 2, which is the why, which is asking you to consider which market, regulatory, or stakeholder, or as other climate drivers you're already facing that may be driving you to do TCFD related analysis. And also, if you're not facing any of these drivers yet that you're aware of, we ask you to please consider and list out which you think is most likely to emerge in your region in the next couple of years. All right, so I see some responses coming through. Thank you for those. And a couple more. And I think for the sake of time, we will move on to part 3 of the exercise, which there will be a new link put in the chat. And you will have, we'll actually have to cut this down to probably around 5 minutes to answer these, but you will be provided with a set of questions around the governance and risk management pillars to try and help you think through how you can get started on these 2 pillars and some of the early kind of decisions and things you would need to think about there. So these are going to be long form answers. So write as much as you'd like, and please also consider if you'd like to share with the group when we have the group reflection. Okay, so we're still waiting for your responses for part 3. I do have some folks writing me private chat messages, which is also an option if you're not able to. I understand that there's a couple people on the call that are just blocked from using Google Forms, so our apologies for that, but you're also welcome to include your responses to any of the parts in a message to me privately or to the group. All right, and we'll just give a couple more minutes to allow a couple more responses to come in. Thank you. All right, so we will start looking at the results that we had in the exercise part 1 and part 2. I think Maya will share the results in just a moment. Okay, so if I can ask John and Anu to jump in here as well, but what we saw is actually a really interesting and equal divide between interest in physical risk and transition risks, which is encouraging because TCFD does indeed ask you to look at both. Maya, if you want to go to the next slide. For physical risk, we saw you listed out acute hazards, which is flooding and drought as the ones that seem to be most important to you, as well as extreme heat. Chronic, the two, should be two hazards there actually there's 3, apologies. There's equal interest in those. For transition risk, we see that you're mostly interested or concerned around the policy and regulation changes or carbon or emission targets as a driver, as well as the technological advances and changes. So there's a couple of you that said I didn't select that, so that's fine. And in terms of the top transition risk drivers, climate risk management governance drivers, we're seeing oversight or pressure from financial supervisors and stakeholders. So that could be your investors or your banks, people lending to you or investing in you.
Can I jump in there, Robin?
Yeah.
I think that that's quite interesting that, you know, this oversight, this pressure from financial and your stakeholders, because this is generally what we're seeing around the world as well, and that clearly comes in often at a board level. So this is why we see governance as particularly important, about having the governance of an organisation such that it's able to respond and pick up these messages and then begin to start to think about, well, what does that actually mean to our business? So the signals are in place. I think that's quite important from this.
All right. So I will now actually move to share my screen. We've got 4 people that have responded to the part 3. It is quite long, but I'll move to share my screen so we can look at those together. And let me know, Maya or Anu and John, if you can see that okay.
Yep, yeah, it's good.
Okay. Okay, so governance pillar. We can see that ESG and sustainability teams are listed, but also we see credit risk, which is important. We do want to flag that you should look across more than just the ESG and sustainability teams and start to bring in the analytical capacity within your organizations, which may be residing in the credit risk and business teams. And here with the governance pillar, the second question, we're asking you sort of the routes to the board, or which board committees or subcommittees could take responsibility, do you think? So you've listed out, and you can see what your colleagues, your peers have listed out too. There'll be sort of ESG committees, risk management committees, financial committees. And in terms of which senior manager could take responsibility, we see suggestions from all types of different senior management positions, which is encouraging.
And on that, Robin, one of the features, when I talked about how regulation is starting to come through, even if it's quasi-regulation at this stage, in the UK, there is a requirement on the financial institutions to appoint a board level owner of this, and that person has to be nominated and known to the regulator as well. So you can see that ownership being enshrined in the governance of the business.
Sure, and that's kind of a key example that probably will take place in other regions as well as this starts to unfold. I think the last one on the governance pillar, we wanted to flag and have you start to think about some of the things that may be barriers that you will face for the board picking this up. So this is important so that everyone's kind of aware of these so you can start to think about this. We see, importantly, that picking this up on boards is maybe slower in this region. This could be due to lack of data and information available to them, and also lack of external pressure and commitments. Although I think John touched on and tried to highlight really clearly that the wider sector that you operate in is very much acting on this, so it only may be a matter of time before your board picks it up and hears about it.
I think that point though about climate impacts and showing effects on revenue models, I absolutely understand that pressure, because inevitably until somebody sees the numbers, is it really an issue? Is it material? But the only way you will understand the materiality to your organization is actually if you start to explore and look, as well as obviously looking at what your peers are doing, what they're finding, and any relative studies. And that actually is where potentially joining in with some of the initiatives and sharing background knowledge you might find useful as well to help you do that.
Absolutely. And so in the chat, we've got Sandeep Mukherjee, who, apologies, Sandeep, I know you're not able to join the Google form, but you've put something that does touch on this here, and that a challenge that you're facing is essentially, translating climate risk in terms of financial loss. And only then maybe top management will acknowledge the risk. But I think you do see a lot of emerging examples, and I touched on the one from, the studies that have been emerging through Unipify. You see examples of firms that have calculated this for their regions, and it's almost a matter of you don't look, you won't find it. So it could be the case that you could look at other literature published of other organizations doing this as early evidence that you may need to take to the board.
There's another question there about sustainability professionals thinking differently from financial professionals, and I think that's also reflected a little bit about sometimes climate change being seen as an environmental ESG issue and missing the point that this is actually about core business model impacts. So yes, the critical step is to get to the point where your credit risk teams, your lending risk teams, your investment analysts, etc., are beginning to understand and see this is critical to the way they make their decisions, because that's the sort of the capacity capability gap that has to be bridged. And
Absolutely.
again, that's why governance is so important, because it does need active involvement from the board right at the top to encourage that change in thinking.
Exactly. So I don't know if there's ways, there could be ways to start to make the case to financial professionals in your organization about the financial risks of climate. And that way, getting their buy-in early on is absolutely essential. We've had examples where we work with organizations where just credit risk teams don't have time or energy to engage, but once they started to actually see the ways that they could calculate this and sort of perturb their credit risk models with climate-related information, they got on board quickly. It was just in the beginning, they're a bit hesitant, so definitely feel the pain there. Okay, so we don't have a lot more time, but I want to move to the risk management pillar and some of the answers we've seen there. I just started to, we put this question to have you start thinking about the capacities that you might need, and if you have that, and to start to think about external support. Um, you know, we do see a couple firms saying, yes, we actually do need support. A lot that's across the board, no matter which market you're in. We see a lot of organizations needing external support because it is quite technical. Some of this type of analysis that we're doing. That's not to say that all of it needs to be outsourced, but and that you do probably have teams of people who are very capable at looking at some of this stuff. But for example, physical risk analysis needs to take place in a GIS environment, and GIS skills are usually lacking in financial institutions, but it could be one thing to think about surveying in your organization who actually might be able to do that. And GIS allows you to essentially layer climate data and information with your holdings and create maps and different sorts of analysis that way. Moving on to thinking about the different time horizons, and this is also coming through in the group chat as well. So TCFD prescribes climate scenario analysis for the purpose of trying to get financial institutions, is very much intended to get you to think beyond your normal horizons, because that's kind of how you can think about building resilience in the face of uncertainty, and thinking about it that way. And so we just asked, how long are you really willing to look out? Because you know, you will have to um, essentially get comfortable looking further out than you might, in order to do this scenario analysis for both physical and transition. And here we see one firm, that's great. You're able to look out 20 years. That's fantastic. Some of these are, yeah, 25-year horizon, but a lot of them are in the 5 to 10 or, you know, 4 to 6 year.
And just picking up one of the questions in the chat room about difficult to translate long-term risk and back into the short-term perspective. And yes, that's absolutely critical to this, because one of the challenges is that the climate models, they were never originally designed to do this job. And they do look at future time slices, 20-year time slices based on the 2030s, 40s, 50s, etc. This is where some interesting work is now going on, starting to understand the fact that we've been on a climate change curve for quite a few years now. And if you look backwards and start to correlate performance, revenues, costs, etc., against climate change, you can start to build up more near-term analysis that can help you think about what does this actually mean in the next 2 to 5 years, but then context against the climate models. So there's some interesting work now going on, which others, including us, are involved in, trying to not just talk about 2030s and 50s, etc., but talk about the next 5 years in order that this can be done. But it can only be done by actually working with the financial services sector, because it's a question of sharing data as well.
Thanks, John. And the next risk management pillar question we asked is around, if you do need external support, how can you start to look for that? And you know, we do have firms here listing out consultants and advisory. And one of the recommendations we wanted to make here is to go ahead and do a screen of providers out there. There are a lot of specialist advisors on physical and transition risk. You will need different advisors for each of those, to be clear. But also, in the absence of that, this is where you can come back to the networks that we talked about and the Unipify sort of methodologies and the other sort of peer action groups that are getting started on TCFD. So they won't be able to, you know, those networks are not going to be designed to do the analysis in-house with you, but they can be a place that you can start to look for external support as well as just consultants and doing that screen. So do have a look there and try and engage where you can. And then I think we've come to our last few questions here with the risk management pillar, thinking about qualitative and versus quantitative analysis. I think everybody, you know, most people have listed qualitative, and that's good to see, because TCFD does, I think, intend to get firms to do quantitative work, but it also is, there's been a lot of kind of talk about this in the sort of in this space over the last few years since TCFD has been released, and which is around the acceptability, how acceptable is qualitative in the early stages, and it absolutely is, and it's probably really essential while you're still building up the capacity and sort of dealing with the translation of climate risks into financial risks and then back into your models. There is a big um, you know sort of chasm there, and as we're gapping that, we need to look at qualitative analysis, which can be a way forward. And we saw that with the Itaú example as well. So they did quantitative work, and then they put it back into a qualitative sort of impact score, which helped them make sense of it going forward. So we do encourage qualitative as well as quantitative. Okay, and then the last one here, how can you link to existing risk management frameworks? I'm just looking through these here. So it is hard to achieve, and the process is slow. I mean, credit ratings is one that we looked at in the Unipify project. That was kind of one clear way. But I don't know if John, if you want to pick up on this at all.
Yeah, I think one of the interesting features that we were doing with the 16 commercial banks originally with Unipify, that's now 35 banks, is that we all recognized very early on that in order to integrate climate change into the thinking of a bank, it had to be integrated into the credit risk model. That was the key operational process that had to pick this up. So the work was undertaken to try and work out how do we get from a temperature figure out of a climate model into a revenue impact on a farmer in Australia, for example, such that we could then look at, could you now perturb the credit rating models, credit risk models. So that is the way forward. It's not to come up with a totally different risk management framework within your organization. The trick is, how do you perturb the existing frameworks you have so they account for climate change?
Okay, thank you for that, John. And I think I will stop sharing my screen now, and Maya's gonna bring up the question and answer. Due to time, we'll probably just be able to take 1 or 2 questions. So if you give us a minute to get that set up, and we can answer those. We also plan to answer your questions in writing in the final slide deck that you will be sent out. Just a moment.
Okay, Robin, they're shared.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so I think one of the key questions I'm seeing coming through, and Anu and John, please do jump in, is you've discussed the impact of physical and transition risk as separate risks. I haven't seen much analysis in the market on the correlation between the two. Is this something you've looked at as an organization, given its relative importance?
Okay. Wow, that's a really big question. And it's a question that is not being addressed very well at the moment. TCFD itself tends to major on the transition side rather than the physical side, so it's not giving equal weight there. And even with notwithstanding that, it's then not linking the two together. And in fact, no initiative really is at this stage. And that is quite important. So to just give you a practical example, one of the effects of a physical risk is as our temperatures increase, we need more energy for cooling purposes. But when you look at the scenarios that are being developed for transition, in the main, they don't take that into account. So there are some challenges with some of the scenarios that are being used on the transition side that they're not actually taking into account the effects of a changing climate. So this is a space that needs to be explored in far more detail. But of course, the problem is we're just getting organizations and people to begin to understand the basic science on climate change and the need to transition. And yet the science hasn't caught up with trying to understand the relationship between the two so far. So it is a big question. It is extremely important, and it's a watch this space one.
Definitely, and I'll just add in here that we know in the UK, the Bank of England's stress test exercise for this year is a climate stress test, and in that, they set out a set of scenarios that do somewhat touch or try to touch on the overlap in some of the scenarios they set out. That exercise is required for banks and insurers here. It's been delayed because of COVID, so firms won't need to do it for a little while yet, but I think that could be one of the first times where it sets out an exercise that does try and ask firms to look at them in conjunction. So, but as John says, it really is an emerging kind of convergence there. Okay, so I think for the sake of time, we need to move on to the wrap up. And I apologize if we didn't get to your question, but we can make an effort to answer your other questions in writing in the back of the deck that we send to you. So next slide. In the last few minutes together, we want to come back to the learning objectives for this training session. And we hope that we really made a strong case for taking action on climate risk management via the TCFD framework for you and illuminated some of the initial actions you can take, in particular in the governance and risk management pillars of it. When you're looking at these pillars, you want to consider which risks and drivers are relevant to you and your holdings. And in a first instance, what's your intuition there? And you want to essentially sketch out what your analysis could look like, and then think about how to get buy-in in your organization to start conducting that. So tapping into those networks, finding other examples of financial impacts that you may need to gather evidence to get firms to, or sorry, other teams within your firms to start to take notice as well. I will draw attention again to that table of recommended networks, and also a couple slides forward. Don't change slides, Maya, but in the back of this deck that you will receive, there are a set of recommended readings and literature which may help you as well as you're sort of gathering evidence and thinking about getting buy-in within your organization. There's also the longer list of resources that were provided in webinar 1, and so just draw your attention back to those resource tables as well. And sort of in the last minute, next slide, we want to just mention that CDC are planning to do more training for you and for its clients on climate risk and TCFD. So there's potentially going to be an in-person training in the South Asia region, and COVID willing, and the details on that are sort of to be determined, but could take place in 2021. So I will let CDC say anything here, and if not, then thank you very much for attending, and stay tuned for that further training. All right, I think that's it then. Thank you, everybody, and we will send out the slides and recording shortly.
Thank you.